Okay, everyone is now muted and we're recording. Good morning, everybody. It is a true delight to welcome you all to the Joseph Yoshor Memorial Lecture, which has now become a fixture in our community, thanks to the Yoshor and Kupferman families. This year is different than all other years in that we are doing this in a virtual modality, but we've already seen a wonderful silver lining that friends and family from Israel are able to participate, and we're able to greet and say hello to people we haven't seen in quite some time who have visited Houston, but obviously this year we're unable to. And so despite our desire to be face-to-face with each other, this method does bring with it some positive aspects. I'm going to ask Daniel to get us started by saying a few words, and then I'll say a few words, introduce our speaker, who you are all eagerly waiting for. So Daniel, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Gelman. Thanks to everyone for joining, and good morning or good afternoon, or I guess good evening, wherever you are. It is really very meaningful for me to welcome everyone to this fourth annual lecture in memory of my late father, Joseph J. Yoshor, Yoshua Yosef ben Harav Moshe Meir, husband, father, grandfather, and really friend to so many of us in attendance today. It's hard to believe that it's been 4 years since my dad passed away, and I always think of it, the pain has definitely faded, but the good news is the memories remain as strong as ever, and they really do. I remember my dad for his kindness, his gentleness, his caring nature, and I think everyone here who knows him would say the same. My dad, in this really unusual time in our nation's history, in our world history, where extreme opinions and a lack of courtesy seem to prevail. My father was a person who had very strong opinions, many of which I disagreed with very strongly. But one thing I always have to note about my dad, and my son Ben said this at his funeral, is my dad was always able to hold fast to his opinions and disagree with others, but always was respectful of others and was kind and generous to others. And I think that's something I certainly don't measure up to, but it's something I think I can aspire to, and it would be better, the whole world would be better if we were able to engage in that way. We miss him very much, and it's not like we're not remembering him every day, but this is a special day for us. It is, of course, very appropriate to honor my dad's memory and for all of us to gather in this way, and that is to learn Torah together. My dad really, at his heart, was a man of letters, as a lawyer and as a teacher, and really his passion, his enthusiasm for reading really knew no bounds. He loved to read, he loved to engage in study, and above all, he really loved Torah study. And after he retired, and he spent 10 years in retirement in Houston, and they were wonderful years, and every year I should acknowledge some hakarat tov to the Houston, to the UOS community, who really welcomed my father so warmly. And he really had real friends in Houston. And one of the highlights of his living in Houston was he wasn't just another retired old man in the shul. He was everybody's chavrusa. He really learned with people, and he loved learning with people. And he loved learning by himself. And Torah study was a huge part of his life. That was his greatest pleasure in retirement, along with his family, was the opportunity to learn and to do daf yomi and to try out the different variants of the Hebrew Koran versus the English Koran versus the, all the different iterations as he went through daf yomi, and really gathering together to honor him in this way, learning with a distinguished visiting scholar, I think is just absolutely appropriate and fitting, and it means a great deal to me and my entire family that we're all gathering in this way. And I just want to review, in the past 4 years, we've really had outstanding visiting scholars. The first year we had Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. The second year we had Moshe Halbertal. The third year we had Rabbi Ari Berman, the president of Yeshiva University. And this year, maintaining that tradition of the very highest standards, we will have Yael Ziegler, a really outstanding Tanakh scholar. So I'm really pleased, and I will let Rabbi Gelman have the honor of formally introducing her. But I, on behalf of my family, want to thank Yael for taking time out of her busy schedule and sharing her wisdom. I've read her written works, and I've been impressed. And I think she really will add yet another luminary to the list of people who have joined us to learn for a bit of our day in memory of my late father. So thank you very much. Rabbi Gelman, I'd like to pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And again, thank you to the Yoshor and Kupferman families for sponsoring this yearly lecture. We really have had a wonderful, wonderful collection of scholars, and this year is certainly no exception. I want to add a little bit to what Daniel said to honor the memory of Joe. I have wonderfully fond memories of Joe in shul. Besides being someone who loved to learn, he also was someone who loved to daven. And you know, you could tell the people who know what they're doing in shul and who appreciate being in shul from the way they carry themselves in shul, the way they focus on the tefillah. And that is something that stood out to me about Joe. He was regularly in shul. I think I've shared this with folks once before. He was always very plugged into what was going on in shul, so much so that I must have said something in a Devar Torah or sermon which he disagreed with, and he shouted out, I think, "Not true, Rabbi Gelman," something like that. But it was always, as Daniel said, in a search for emet, search for truth. He was really desirous of understanding the Torah and applying it to our lives. He fit into our community without missing a beat because he was easy to talk to, and because he was so well read and so well informed. He had something to talk about with anyone. And I think it's important to note that even though he was a scholar and really well read, he came across as a regular Joe. I couldn't resist. He came across as a regular person who, you know, you could put your arm around and really get to know. And it was a true honor to have Joe in our community, and he contributed to our community in all of those ways. And for that, I'm so grateful to have had him here for 10 years. I must mention Shula, of course, who is a favorite student of mine for many years. I'm not sure if I'm a favorite teacher of hers, but she's a favorite student of mine. And I will say, Shula, kudos to you for quickly picking up the Zoom etiquette and without missing a beat, being able to join all the shiurim and programs that we have at UOS going through Zoom. It just is a credit to your commitment to studying Torah and to your desire to remain connected to your friends and loved ones in the community. And I say loved ones because people really do love you in this community and cherish having you in our community. I know you miss Joe very much, but you carry on his memory by studying Torah and speaking about him and staying connected to your family. One of the great memories I have is watching Deborah with Joe and Shula taking walks around the neighborhood, sometimes with both, sometimes just with Joe, and now with Shula. I still see that. And that is, again, a testament to the wonderful children that you have raised. So thank you, Shula, for continuing to be an active part of our community. May this continue for you in good health, ad mea ve'esrin. Okay, now it is my real treat to introduce you all very briefly to this year's scholar Yael Ziegler. Yael is a senior lecturer of Tanakh in the Herzog College and at Matan. She received her BA from Stern College, an MA and PhD from Bar Ilan University. Dr. Ziegler has lectured widely on various topics in Tanakh in Israel, in the United States, South Africa, Australia, and Europe. She's the author of Promises to Keep, The Oath in Biblical Narrative, and Ruth from Alienation to Monarchy, which has also been published in Hebrew as Ruth Minikor Lemelucha. And she has a forthcoming book on Megillat Eicha that is scheduled, or maybe has already come out. Maybe you'll correct me about that. Dr. Ziegler lives in Alon Shvut with her husband and their 5 children. And it is really a wonderful treat for us to welcome you, Dr. Ziegler. I'm going to turn the floor over to you and spotlight your video. Welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Okay, I'm putting up the PowerPoint presentation. I hope that you can see it. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction. It's an honor to speak in memory of Joseph Yoshor. I want to speak tonight about some of our beloved biblical figures to see if we can see how they converge, how they interact, even though we don't usually put them together. And the 2 that I'm going to be talking about tonight are Shimshon and David. I think that it certainly is something that we see a great deal of in the different midrashim, in the different ways that Chazal read the Tanakh, is that they're often encouraging us to compare and contrast different biblical figures with the idea that in order to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of our different biblical figures, when we look at them one in light of the other, we can begin to get deeper insights and sometimes also understand what are the accomplishments of these different biblical characters. Sometimes Chazal and the Midrashim draw our attention to the similarities between different figures. So, some that come to mind that we won't be speaking about tonight are, for example, we have upcoming the Chag of Purim, and when we think about Esther, we immediately note the parallels between Esther and Yosef, right? I mean, we have these 2 figures who are the children of Rachel, who rise to greatness in a foreign palace and wind up saving their people, right? Those are 2 very similar figures, and the Midrashim are familiar with that kind of similarity. They're attuned to it. They draw our attention to those similarities. Another example of 2 biblical figures that seem very similar and that the Midrash and Chazal are very attuned to their similarity are, for example, Pinchas and Eliyahu, right? 2 zealous figures, 2 figures that are oftentimes associated one with the other. And these are the kinds of associations that arise a great deal in the different midrashim, and they're used in order to give us a sense of some of the strengths of these figures and maybe also their major roles in the story. And sometimes, this is more interesting, and this is what we're going to be doing tonight, we're interested in how similar characters become actually very different from one another. In other words, characters that start out that seem to be very similar and wind up on very different paths. And we actually call this, there's a name for this type of phenomenon in literature. It's called mirror characters, or perhaps inverted characters. I see that there are a lot of people on from Israel. In Hebrew, we call this phenomenon dimuyot bavu'ah, right? Which are basically mirror figures, characters that start out the same, they seem to be compared, but they actually eventually are meant to be contrasted one with the other. Now, just to a little bit give you a sense that this is a wider phenomena. So, this exists in literature as well. Think, for example, of King Lear and Gloucester, right? Or to use a more pedestrian example, Harry and Lord Voldemort. Right? There's a good example, right? So they both have the same wand. They're essentially the same kind of figure, but of course, ultimately their paths diverge and one chooses to use his character, his strengths for good, and the other chooses to use that for evil, right? And we have a great deal of these kinds of mirror paired characters in Tanakh, and Chazal often draw our attention to them. I think it's a wonderful way to understand the weaknesses and the strengths of different characters, what their faults are, what their ultimate accomplishments are. I'll throw out a few examples. We're not going to be talking about each of these examples, but just in order to make it a little more of a broader phenomenon, I'll throw out a couple examples. Think about Esav and David, right? Both of these characters are described as admoni or ruddy, right? They both have a proclivity to violence, and both of them set out with 400 men in order to do battle with someone who they are somewhat angry at, right? And of course, the stories go in vastly different directions. Okay, so David and Esav have similar kinds of temperament, but one uses his temperament for good and the other uses his temperament for bad. There are so many examples of this. Think of Bilam and Avraham. Think of Eliyahu and Izebel. I could go on, but it's a little unfair because I'm not going to properly actually unpack these ideas. But we really actually have a great deal of figures in Tanakh that are compared, but actually only to be contrasted. And I think that ultimately the moral lesson of this, and there is a very strong moral lesson that comes with this idea, is a pedagogical point, and that is that even though many people can be born with similar character traits, with similar tendencies, with similar proclivities, this ultimately does not determine their destiny. It can influence their destiny. It can give them the raw material that they have to work with throughout their life, but ultimately it does not predetermine who they are. In the end, those character traits that we are born with are raw material. What we do with them, that's our choice. No one is born a tzaddik. No one is born a rasha. No one is born good. No one is born bad. And we see this through the prism of having a lot of different pairs of characters who kind of start out the same, but who make choices in their life that take them in vastly different directions. Now, there's a wonderful midrash to this effect, which is going to guide this shiur. So I'm going to really open with this midrash. The midrash appears here in Kohelet Rabbah, and it brings for us all sorts of different character traits that multiple figures have in Tanakh. So, for example, it starts out by saying, "Yesh shehirbu chokhmah letovatan, v'yesh shehirbu chokhmah lera'atan." Some people use their wisdom for good, and some people use it for bad. And they bring two examples of people who use wisdom for good, Moshe and Shlomo, and two examples of people who use their wisdom for evil purposes, Doeg Ha'adomi and Achitophel. And so the idea is that a lot of people can be born with great intelligence. That's not a question. The question is what you do with that intelligence. Intelligence is not your destiny. Intelligence is the raw material with which you can ultimately form your destiny, right? Some people are born with great strength. Some people are born into great wealth. Some people are born into strong families that have many children in the family. All of these things can be used as an advantage, or they can be used for evil. And I think that this is a very useful midrash. I think it's a very pedagogical midrash. It tells us that ultimately it is us that determine what we do with that raw material. No one is born with their destinies already developed for them. And to see this idea clearly, I want to talk tonight about some of the similarities that I see between two, I think, very prominent biblical figures, one of whom is David, and I assume that most of us are deeply familiar with David. I don't think that there's another figure, maybe Moshe, who has as many chapters that are devoted to describing his career, his life's trajectory as David. And the other one is Shimshon. And I want to talk a little bit about the fundamental similarities between them, but ultimately I want to propose that they're mirror figures, that they're not similar figures, that they start out similar, and that they wind up taking their lives on very, very different paths. But before I get there, I want to start with the background of Shimshon and David and talk a little bit about their tribes. Okay, so I think it's pretty well known that David comes from the tribe of Yehuda. Perhaps it's a little bit less well known that Shimshon comes from the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Yehuda, it has been described by Yaakov when he gives his blessings, when he gives the blessings to his sons, as a gur aryeh, a lion cub. Yehuda is a lion cub. I think this is pretty well known. I think many of us have encountered it in all sorts of artistic forms, right? You go into shul. I've never been in your shul, but in many shuls, they have, some sort of glass, stained glass or some sort of artistic rendition of each of the tribes. And Yehuda is always represented as a lion. Now, Dan tends to be represented as a snake, right? Because that, of course, is what Yaakov says about Dan. When Yaakov blesses the sons, he compares Dan to a snake. And therefore, I think it's sometimes a little bit less well known that when Moshe blesses the tribes, at the end of Sefer Devarim, he describes Dan as a gur aryeh, right? Dan gur aryeh. Dan is also a lion cub, which I think is fascinating, right? We have these two tribes that share something, some kind of leadership characteristic, which is very similar, right? And this leadership characteristic, the Midrash tells us, what does it mean that he's a lion cub? I know what a lion is. A lion has strength. A lion has power. A lion has leadership. Well, the Midrash tells us, Natan lo gvura shel ari. He gave him the strength of a lion. V'chutzpah shel gurav, right? And the audacity, the chutzpah of the cub, right? So that's the nature of the lion cub. He has strength, he has power, he has bridled fierceness, right? He has this ferociousness. And of course, he is the ultimate figure of leadership. And we know, in fact, that both of these tribes are leadership tribes. I brought for you this little diagram of the way that the tribes encamped around the Mishkan. And there are 4 groups of tribes, okay? And each of these groups has a leader. One of the leaders, the one on the eastern side of the camp, is Yehuda. On the western side of the camp, we have Ephraim. On the northern side of the camp, we have Dan. And so Dan is positioned as a leadership tribe, right? He is one of the 4 leaders of the 12 tribes. It's, a minor position of leadership, but he is considered to be a leader. And I think that perhaps relates to the fact that he is described as a gur aryeh. But what I really want to ask is, and, I'll direct this to some of the parents among us. Do we really want 2 tribes that are gur aryeh, right? I mean, one tribe, that's sufficient for us. Why would we want within one family 2 tribes that have this kind of unbridled ferocity, that have this kind of leadership trait, right? It seems to be a recipe for a clash within a family. And the question is really why we need more than one tribe with those kinds of traits. So, I'm going to propose 2 different ideas, one of which I'm going to develop now, and another of which I'm going to leave for later. One possible reason that maybe we have two tribes with this lion-like, leonine-like character, is that, sometimes we need two tribes to work in conjunction one with the other. Sometimes we might need two leaders working together. And I'm going to show you a couple cases in which Yehuda and Dan are positioned to work together in kind of a joint effort of leadership. That I'm going to show you in a moment. But the other thing that I want to suggest is that, as I said before, we know that no trait is good and no trait is bad. All of these traits are raw material. It can be either used for good or it can be very dangerous. And of course, in this case, it's true as well. Yehuda is a lion cub, right? He could use that for good or could use that for bad. And perhaps we have two tribes that are given this kind of leadership just in case one fails, just in case one does not use it properly. We need to have a backup plan. Okay, so we're going to come back to that in a minute. I want to start by showing you that I think that the Midrash, or some of the Midrashim, I only brought you one example in the Midrash, but I found several Midrashim that use this as an example. Several Midrashim note that there is this lion-like similarity between the tribe of Yehuda and the tribe of Dan, and they show how effective it can be when Yehuda and Dan work together in a strong, protective leadership role. This midrash that I just put up on screen, which we won't read it together, just to save time, is a midrash that describes what happens when Yosef tries to take Binyamin as a slave. Of course, the brothers don't know that it's Yosef, right? He's the ruler of Egypt, and he tries to take Yehuda as a slave, and the midrash says Yehuda becomes enraged and he roars a great lion-like roar, and the son of Dan joins him and bounds from Canaan to Egypt in order to be this kind of explosive pair of brothers who are going to save Binyamin from the hands of the Egyptian ruler. What interests me about this midrash are not the details of the midrash. What interests me about this midrash is that the midrash seems to be recognizing that each of these lion cubs, on their own merit, right, in their own right, are powerful figures. But when they work together, watch out. They are an explosive combination. And we see that in several different ways. Now I'm going to turn our attention not to the Midrash, but to the actual Tanakh, where we actually do see several times in which Dan and Yehuda are given a task that they can only fulfill together. And I think they're given the task because they are the lion-like tribes. So the first occasion in which we have this is in the description in Bimidbar, chapter 10, in Parak Yud in Bimidbar, when we're told how and in what order the tribes should march through the desert toward the land of Israel. So we're told, of course, Yehuda is positioned at the front, right? Yehuda is always positioned at the front. The front is a leadership position. Of course, it's the vanguard, right? He has to lead the people toward the land, right? But we also need someone at the back. The back is another kind of vulnerable position. We need someone strong at the back. We need a strong rear guard. Don't forget that when Amalek attacks the people, right? And that's, of course, going to be this past week's Parsha, right? When Amalek attacks the people, we are told, Vayizanev becha et kol hanechashalim acharecha, right? He cut off from you. That's actually in the description of Amalek in Devarim, Perek Kafeh. He cut off the weak ones from the back, right? The ones who fall behind to the back of the camp, the sick, the elderly, the young, right? And so we need to position at the back of the camp as they're on their journey a strong tribe. And that is Dan. So Yehuda and Dan are the only two tribes that are given this kind of special protective role in the march of the nation towards the land of Israel through the desert. Dan and Yehuda are powerful. They are placed in the two vulnerable spots. They work together in order to protect the nation. And now I want to show you that this idea seems to find expression in their position in the land of Israel as well. I brought for you here a map. Look at where Yehuda is. Yehuda is down there on the southern border. He is the one that is protecting Israel from their southern neighbors who have never been particularly friendly. I'm talking, of course, about Egypt. And Dan, well, Dan, it's interesting. Dan actually gets two different nachalot. He gets two different portions in the land. I'm going to start with his northern portion. You see where my cursor is? Some of you in the good old days, when you would visit Israel on a very hot day, sometimes maybe you would take a tiyul in a place called Tel Dan, right? That's on the northern part of Israel, right? It's up here in the north. And that is, of course, a very, very vulnerable spot in the land. I mean, at least between Yehuda and Egypt, we have a big desert to buffer us, right? Between Dan and our northern neighbors, we have no buffer zone, right? Dan, of course, has to battle not just Aram, but he eventually has to battle the Assyrians, Ashur, who come from Nineveh up there in the north. Eventually, he has to battle the Babylonians, who, even though they're down here in the southeast, they travel northward and then southward through Dan in order to attack the people. And so Dan is positioned in a very vulnerable spot in the land of Israel, the most vulnerable spot. Yirmiyahu says, Mitzafon tipatach hara'ah. The evils are going to come from the north. And look at that. Yehuda and Dan are positioned on our borders, just like they were positioned when we walked through the desert, right? So Yehuda is our southernmost tribe. Dan is on our northernmost border. They protect our flanks. Now, by the way, I did mention before that Dan has two positions. He gets two inheritances. That's, here we have Tel Dan, but down here, right, if you see my cursor, maybe it's a little hard to see it, it's on the southwest, right, of the land of Israel. It's where the Dan buses are, right? So that's another, kind of contemporary reference to where Dan is. So Dan gets actually two portions in the land. It's an interesting question why. I'm not going to get into it right now, but I will mention that in his position here, Dan and Yehuda are again being positioned as partners to fight the most important initial existential threat to the people when they enter the land of Israel, and that is the Philistines, the Plishtim. Look at where the Plishtim are. The Plishtim are here on the southwest, right here, right? The cities of the Plishtim. And Dan and Yehuda together, they are the buffer zone that kind of protect, that buffer between the nation and those formidable Philistines. We're going to talk about those Plishtim again in the continuation of our shiur. But what I'm trying to say about Dan and Yehuda is that they're the strong Gor Aryeh, and they work together. They are positioned to work together in order to protect the people. And this is what I think this Midrash tells us, the Sifrei in Devarim tells us, that Dan is a lion cub. And why does he need to be a lion cub? Because he is placed adjacent to the border, and any tribe that is in that vulnerable position better be a Gor Aryeh. He better be a strong Leonine tribe, right? So we have this idea that Yehuda and Dan are very similar. There are two other ways that I want to note their similarity, and we'll do this a little quicker. Look at how we have in Shemot, Perek Lamed Aleph, right? When God appoints the artisans who are going to build the Mishkan, he appoints a man named Bitzalel, who is from the tribe of Judah, and along with him, he appoints a man named Oholiav, who is from the tribe of Dan. These two tribes together are responsible for building the Mishkan. Something about them, their strength, their passion, their leadership abilities are not just meant to be protective, they are also meant to be somehow engaged in leading the people in the spiritual realm as well. Okay, now, based on these psukim, the Ibn Ezra brings Rav Sadia Gaon, who explains that the reason that these two men are chosen is because they come from the Leonine tribes. They come from the lion-like tribes. The Ibn Ezra doesn't like this approach, but he brings it, right? So this is the approach of Rasag. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have the Rasag on Sefer Shemot, so I brought it for you in the Ibn Ezra. But here, I think this idea is that their role also relates to the spiritual realm, their leadership role. And a midrash tells us that it was the combination of Yehuda and Dan, of these two tribes, who also built the Beit HaMikdash. It wasn't just Shlomo, who was from the tribe of Yehuda. Along with him, there was a man named Hiram, not to be confused with Hiram, the king of Tzur, a different Hiram who was from the tribe of Dan. And that's point number 2. And the third point that I want to make about the way that Yehuda and Dan work together is actually a midrashic idea, right? This idea does not appear in the Tanakh. This midrash tells us that the ultimate Messiah, the Mashiach, is going to come from two tribes. Now, you're all scratching your head and saying, wait a second, we all know the Mashiach is going to come from Yehuda. So this midrash says, yes, that's true. His father will be from the tribe of Yehuda, and that's why we always say that Mashiach comes from Yehuda, but his mother is going to come from the tribe of Dan. And that's because we are looking for this ultimate kind of strength and passion in leadership that is going to be an explosive combination of our two lion-like tribes. Okay, so what we've established so far is that these two tribes, Dan and Yehuda, are very similar. They have similar kinds of character traits in terms of their leadership, in terms of their protective role, in terms of their spiritual role, in terms of their ability to bring about the leadership. And even though they can function individually in order to be lion-like in their leadership, when they function together, they can achieve really extraordinary results. But before we go on, I want to say one more thing about the lion. And that is that, of course, as we know, and as I mentioned before, every trait, especially a very powerful trait, has potential for good and potential for bad. And the stronger the trait is, and I think many parents among us know this as well, the stronger the personality, the more it can be used for great good, and the more it can be used for great, I won't say evil, but great not good, right? And this is true, I think, also about regarding Yehuda as the Gur Aryeh. There's a midrash, I think it's a very poignant midrash, in which when the brothers bring Yaakov, the ketonet pasim, right, the cloak that was dipped in blood, and Yaakov says the words, Ketonet bini, indeed, that is the cloak of my son. Chaya ra'a achalatu, an evil animal has eaten him. The midrash says, you know who he was referring to? Yaakov was referring to Yehuda. Yaakov thought that Yehuda had killed Yosef because he knew that Yehuda had the potential to use violence in order to promote his aims. And he deeply suspected what turned out, thank God, not to be true, but he deeply suspected that Yehuda had used his lion-like qualities for bad. He had used it for evil. And so ultimately, I think, like anybody with any trait, someone who has leadership, someone who has that lion-like quality of passion and strength, has to self-consciously use those gifts that he was born with for good. And the question that we have whenever we encounter a lion-like figure in Tanakh is, will he use those traits for good, or will he use them for bad? Will he use them to promote his own self-interest, or will he use them to serve God and to help his community? I think that this is true, certainly about every trait, right? We're born with a set of raw material, and ultimately at some point in our life, we are required to identify those traits that we were born with and to somehow try to use them and channel them into our destiny, into using them to help the world, to help our community, to serve God properly. And that's the question that we want to ask whenever we encounter any biblical figure. And that's our responsibility towards ourselves, towards our children. As educators, we are responsible for channeling that raw material to use it for good. But the first, I think, step in this is to be conscious of these gifts, to recognize that the raw material that we have has been given to us by God in order to fulfill our purpose in the world. And this really takes me to the figures that I want to be talking about tonight, who are, certainly our most famous figures from these tribes. Shimshon is our most famous figure from the tribe of Dan, and David is arguably, but likely, our most famous figure from the tribe of Yehuda. The fact that these are our two most famous figures from the lion-like tribes immediately, I think, should draw our attention to what is the most glaring similarity between them, and that is that both of them fight lions with their bare hands, right? Did you ever notice that? Right? Of course, Shimshon, that's pretty famous story, is going down to a place called Timnah, where he wants to get married. And on his way down, this lion comes roaring at him, and he gets Ruach Hashem and he rips that lion to shreds, right? And David, when he's trying to go into battle with Goliath, he says to Shaul, don't worry about the battle. I might be young, but I was a shepherd. And whenever the bear or the lion would come and attack one of the sheep in my flock, I would seize it and I would hit it and I would kill it, right? And, certainly here we have something which is a very unusual act, right? It's an unusual story, and it occurs both about Shimshon and about David. Now, when this first occurred to me, that we have these very similar stories about these two figures, both of whom come from tribes that are described as lion-like tribes, I thought about it a little bit more deeply, and I thought to myself, well, are these figures similar in other ways as well? And what I noticed is that there are three or perhaps four things that seem to create a very strong parallel between these figures. Number one, the first question that I think has a similar answer in both of them is, with what do they fight, right? With what do these men fight? Well, I think what's very striking, both about Shimshon and about David, is that they do not fight with weapons, or not with conventional weapons, right? They walk around unencumbered in very dangerous territory. And whenever they find themselves in a tight spot, they resist, whether it's the jawbone of a donkey, a fox, a stick, a bunch of smooth stones from the wadi, right? But they do not walk around with swords or spears or javelins, right? There's this image of both Shimshon and David as these confident, fearless, powerful people, or powerful men who are so confident that they can be spontaneous in their battles, right? And I think that's an extraordinary similarity between them. Now, who do they fight, right? That's question number two. And I've already noted that they fight this lion. But what's interesting about the fight with the lion is that the fight that they have with the lion is meant to foreshadow the real battle. Both of these men are designated to battle the Philistines. And that is, of course, because the Philistines are ferocious fighters, right? If you can battle a lion, you can battle the Philistines, right? And so Shimshon, who is chosen, who is born, V'hu Yachel lahoshia et Yisrael miyad Plishtim, he is born in order to begin to save the people from the Plishtim. His first act is to show him that he can fight a lion. If he can fight a lion, he can fight the Plishtim. And David recognizes this very explicitly, right? On the way to his battle with Goliath, he says, oh yeah, no problem. I can fight Goliath. I've already fought the Plishtim. But the third point that I want to make in comparison between these two figures is, both David and Shimshon are passionate, charismatic, leader-like personalities. And certainly while this passion can be used to lead the people, to fight Am Yisrael's enemies, to unify the people, to rally them together to serve God, it can be also used for their own personal interests. And the downfall, I think, of both of these men are their passion for women, right? Their misused passion for women. The story of Shimshon ultimately, I think, unravels as a result of it. And I would say the same thing about David's story. In other words, David's story goes awry after the story of Bathsheba. He puts it back together again. The force of his passion for God and his desire for tshuva and his desire to rehabilitate his dynasty in order to serve God ultimately overcomes his kind of misplaced passion. But both of them, that's what we would call their weak point, right? Their Achilles heel, where the story can turn in a negative direction. Now, I have one methodological point, and that is that I started noticing these similarities between David and Shimshon. I hope I've convinced you that these are really seem to be similar characters, right? They seem to share some very kind of unique experiences and unique traits. And my inclination when I do see that sort of thing is to turn to Chazal, because as I started out by saying, Midrashim are very attuned to these kinds of parallels, and it didn't seem likely to me that they would miss one that is this big. And so I immediately went looking, and I took out my Bar Ilan search, and I started searching for a midrash that compares Shimshon and David, and I found one that I think is very disturbing or very troubling on one level. So let's look at the midrash. It happens to be the midrash that I brought before, and I didn't read it inside before intentionally, because this is the midrash where I showed you that the midrash compares and contrasts different figures that were born with similar raw material, but took it in different directions. So the midrash says as follows: Yesh shehirbu gvuratan letovatan. Some people use their strength for good. And there are some people that use it for evil. Who used it for good? David v'Yehuda. Both of them used their strength for good. Who used their strength for bad? Shimshon v'Goliath. I mean, I don't know about you, but I was blown away when I saw this midrash, right? There's one thing to say, let's compare David and Shimshon. David uses it for good, Shimshon for bad. I'm not exactly sure what that means. But to put Shimshon and Goliath in the same category, in opposition to David and Yehuda, those are the forces of good. Those are the forces of evil. That seems somewhat excessive to me. It still, I would venture to say, seems somewhat excessive to me. I'm not going to be so scathing in my presentation of Shimshon, but I do want to try to understand what lies at the heart of this. What's the point of this comparison between David and Shimshon? Where and why does Shimshon go wrong? This midrash is suggesting that David and Shimshon are mirror characters. They're similar in temperament. They're similar in terms of their strengths. They're similar in terms of their proclivities. They're similar in terms of their confidence. They're similar in terms of their potential, but they wind up really different, right? And how, why, what are they trying to say here? I want to start by saying that, first of all, I think that they actually are born into the same mold. They're born into the same time period. It gets a little confusing because they appear in different books, right? But Shimshon is our final judge of the period of the judges. And the period of the judges goes completely awry, right? The period of the judges is a deteriorating period. It's a period of chaos. It's a period of lack of leadership. It's a period that needs a strong leader, a king, a lion-like leader. Let's call him a Mashiach, to fight the enemies, to repair the societal dysfunction. There's civil war after civil war, and it winds up with a full-blown civil war, to unify the people, to rally the people to serve God, to lay the foundations for the Beit HaMikdash. Shimshon is our last hope in the book of Judges. He is from the tribe of Dan, the Me'asef, right? The one who gathers up the pieces, the rear guard. He is our last judge in the period of the Judges. And he is positioned to do all of these things, to lead the people to military victory, to unify the people societally, to rally the people to serve God. And he doesn't, right? And all of the things that he doesn't do, and I know he doesn't do it because the continuation of Sefer Shoftim tells us that that isn't done. All of these things that he doesn't do, David does. David, his mirror character, is able to accomplish all of these things. Now, look, we could argue the finer points with regard to Shimshon. There is a great argument among the different biblical interpreters as to whether or not Shimshon succeeds or fails in his kind of narrow confines of leadership, right? Some of the midrashim and some of the biblical interpreters are very harsh with Shimshon. You look at the Rashbam when he talks about Shimshon in his Perush, in his commentary in Bereshit chapter 49. I won't bring it here, but the Ramban also are very harsh in their overall assessment of Shimshon. But I don't want to talk about the finer points. I just want to say one thing that I'm certain of, and that is that Shimshon does not turn around the period of the Shoftim. He doesn't pull the nation out of the utter chaos, out of the terrible abyss that we find that immediately follows the story of Shimshon. The story of Shimshon is followed by 5 chapters in the book of Judges that are chapters of utter chaos, religious depravity, absence of leadership, civil war, no temple on the horizon. He does not lead the people to any sort of tikkun, not a spiritual tikkun, not a societal tikkun. And from a military perspective, he does not properly oust the Plishtim from the land. The next time that we find the Plishtim, it might be that he kills a lot of them when he brings the house down in that, final moment of vengeance, but he does not oust them from the land. The next time we find the Plishtim, they are as strong as ever, and they're actually going to destroy the Mishkan in Shiloh. And what I want to suggest is that Shimshon could have been different. He could have been the Mashiach. He could have been the leader that repairs this period. He is that lion-like figure that is positioned at the back to take up the rear, to pull the pieces together. He's born a Nazir. He's a religious figure, a religious leader. He's born with a divine oracle that accompanies him. He has a divine destiny. And look at what some of these midrashim say about him, which I think suggests that, in fact, Shimshon could have been David. Look at this midrash. The midrash tells us that when in this pasuk in Bereshit Perek Mem Tet, when Yaakov is blessing the tribe of Dan, when he finishes blessing the tribe of Dan, he says these 3 strange words: Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. In your salvation, I hoped, God. And the Midrash says, why does he say that after he blesses the tribe of Dan? And the Midrash explains, because Yaakov saw with prophecy Shimshon, and he was so excited when he saw him. He thought, he is going to be the Melech HaMashiach. And then he saw that he died. And he turned to God and said, this one dies? We can only hope in you, God. The book of Judges is a book that seems to leave us hovering over an abyss of destruction. Shimshon doesn't pull us out of that period. He could have. Yaakov notes that he could have. The Midrash notes that he could have. Look at this Midrash. This Midrash says as follows: Shimshon's father was from Dan, and his mother was from Yehuda. Remember that? That's the ultimate formula for creating Mashiach. And this midrash, I think, is telling us exactly, what we're saying here, which is that Shimshon could have been the Mashiach. He could have turned around the period of the Shoftim. He could have been the savior of this period. Instead, after Shimshon, we have no leader in the period of the Shoftim. We have just a downward spiral into chaos. We have civil war. We have a sense of imminent destruction. There's nothing hopeful at the end of Sefer Shoftim. So, David is going to turn all that around, which is why I think David is the tikkun of Shimshon. But without getting into the details of the Shimshon story, I just looked at my watch and I saw that we're, starting to get to the end of this shiur. So, how does it go wrong? What does Shimshon do wrong? Right? Ultimately, of course, he does function for some period in his life as an active leader of the people. But to understand Shimshon's failure, I think we have to return to the formula for understanding who applies their character traits properly. And the answer that I suggested before is that the formula is that those who use their traits self-consciously, those who look hard and deep at themselves and recognize that the traits that they have are in fact gifts that have been given them from God to use in order to fulfill their divine purpose, they are the ones who can succeed in life. You see, what happens when Shimshon battles this or fights with this lion is that he then goes down to the Philistines, right? And he marries this Philistine woman, and he offers them a riddle, a wedding amusement. What's the riddle? Do you remember what the riddle is? The riddle is the story of him battling the lion. He turns the story of his ability to destroy, to kill the lion bandily, he turns it into a riddle, a wedding feast amusement. And what we see in the continuation of the story is that Shimshon never uses his strength self-consciously. He never recognizes, he never asks the question, why did God give me the strength to fight a lion? For what purpose? To what end was I given this extraordinary ability? How can I use that ability in order to fulfill my destiny? And so instead, what we find throughout the story is that Shimshon is using the Ruach Hashem, the great strength that God gives him, in order to promote his own interests, in order to protect his own passions. He rarely mentions the nation. He rarely mentions God. He rarely says, I'm doing this for national interest. I say rarely because at one point in the story, he does seem to kind of pull himself together and recognize that he's been given this strength by God in order to serve the people. But by the end of the story, he has undergone another downfall. And once again, we see in that what some people think is a great moment. I would beg to differ, but what some people regard as a great moment where Shimshon brings the house down on those 3,000 Philistines and upon himself, what does he say to God? He says to God, Zochreinina v'chazkenina achapam hazeh ha'elokim. Remember me and strengthen me this time also, God. V'inakma nekam achat. Mishtei enai miplishtim. Let me avenge myself just for one of the eyes that has been blinded by the Plishtim. Right? So what we see is that even at the end of his life, he doesn't seem to have the bigger picture. Shimshon starts out his life by battling a lion, but ultimately, lo noda kocho. He never fully understands why he has been given strength and to what end he is meant to use his great raw material that has been given him by God. I meant to actually have this this screen on before. This is the screen where Shimshon turns his encounter with the lion into a riddle. Okay, so we won't read it inside, but this is the very beginning of his journey. So ultimately, of course, who does accomplish what Shimshon failed to accomplish? Who uses his lion-like strength for leadership, for military victory, to pull Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, out of the downward spiral of the period of the judges? Of course, it's David, right? David, who appears in the next book, but David, who really brings an end to the period of the Shoftim, of the judges. He lays the foundation for the Beit HaMikdash. He has the final battle with the Philistines in the Tanakh. He unites the people. He rallies them together to serve God. He uses his passion, his charisma, his personality to rally the people together to serve God. And again, it doesn't mean that David is perfect. It doesn't mean that David does not fall prey to his weakness, right? I think that, the fact that David also falls prey to his passions in a similar kind of context as Shimshon, only it serves as evidence. This is the flip side of that coin. This is the inherent weakness. This is the vulnerable spot, the fault line of that kind of personality. But fundamentally, David starts out on a path to success. And the reason that David starts out on a path to success is not because he is different from Shimshon in terms of his raw material. And it's not because he was dealt different cards. It's because he immediately understands when he battles a lion that this has intimations of his destiny, that this is giving him the formula for understanding what he is meant to do with his life. When David stands before Shaul and asks Shaul to go and battle Goliath, Shaul says, Lo tuchal lalechet el haplishti hazeh, right? Ki ata na'ar v'hu ish milchama minurav. You can't go fight. You can't go lilachem and fight with this plishti. You are just a boy. And he is an experienced warrior. And David says, but I fought the lion. And David concludes by saying, Hashem asher hitzilani miyad ha'ari umiyad hadov, hu yatzileni miyad haplishti hazeh. God, who gave me the ability to fight the bear and to fight the lion, he will save me from the hand of the plishti. David was given a hint at the beginning of his life, and he understood that he has to take a good, long, hard look at the reason that he was given this great ability, this great strength and confidence and power, and what should he do with it? And that's, I think, what this final midrash is saying here. The midrash tells us, David nitan lo remez v'chash. David is given a hint, and he intuitively understands it. David understands that one is not born with gifts that one is meant to use just on promoting their own self-interest or on enjoying life. David understands that he has been given a strength to use not just for himself, but for his people, for serving God, for fulfilling his divine destiny. He is in a constant search for a way to use it. I think that ultimately the message of this, the moral lesson that emerges from this, as I said before, is one that relates to us certainly as individuals, but also as parents, as educators. We have to be seeking knowledge of ourselves, trying to figure out the essence of the I in order to understand what it takes to fulfill our destiny and the purpose for which we were created. And each of us has to understand our own nature, our own strengths, and try to figure out, why does God give us that? How do we channel them in order to fulfill the destiny into which we were born. I thank you all for your patience. I welcome comments and questions. I see that there are 2 chats. I will look at the chats now. But I also, for those of you who might have questions that you'd like to email me, I put my email here. I'm very happy to hear from anybody who has questions. And now maybe I'll try to look at the chat. How do I look at the chat? Rabbi Gelman, can you see the chat? I don't know why it's not coming up.
Yeah, I have a few questions. Some of
Yeah,
them
go ahead.
were sent to me,
Okay, great.
so I'll read them. Miriam Gottlieb sent a question in Hebrew. אבל אולי זו גם הכנה לתקופת הפיצול בין ישראל ויהודה. היה אכן מקדש גם ביהודה, פיצול שהוא לרעה, אבל מחייב בנהיגה.
In other words, maybe we need a Dan and a Yehuda in order to have 2 separate leaders. I think that that's the context. Part of the problem of answering questions at the end of the shiur is that sometimes we lose the context. But if that's what you mean, I don't think that that's the answer for Yehuda and Dan being lion tribes, because the leader of the northern kingdom is Ephraim. So it's true that we do need 2 leaders later on, but it's never Dan. Dan has a different kind of almost partnership role with Yehuda. Yehuda and Ephraim are, I would say, opposites, right? Who really seem to have very different kinds of leadership and use their leadership very differently, but that will have to be for another time.
Thank you for that. Here's another question. Why is David given a second chance after his grievous sin with Bathsheba and sending her husband to the front lines and to his death? Shimshon never seems to get a second chance.
All right, so I'll start by saying Shimshon gets 3 second chances, right? We have 3 different stories of Shimshon with women. Shimshon gets many chances. He gets Ruach Hashem over and over and over, even though he's using it for his own personal vengeance, throughout chapter 14, throughout chapter 15, and even after he's had these, rather strange stories with the different women in his life. As for David, David gets a second chance, but it is a very painful process. The story of David, more than anything else, is the story of repentance. And that will have to be for a different shiur. But David doesn't easily get a second chance. Ultimately, the possibility for repentance is learned from David, because David sins egregiously, as Abarbanel points out, and he does a fantastic tshuva, an unparalleled kind of repentance. And I think it's a wonderful story for that reason, but he doesn't easily get a second chance. So, yeah.
Thank you. Another question. Why is the Midrash, I think it asked me to flesh out the Midrash. Why does the Midrash equate Shimshon and Goliath for using their power for evil?
Yeah. So I actually do think that the Midrash is a little excessive. I did mention that. I wouldn't have phrased it that way. It's a important Midrash in my eyes, because it's showing that there are parallels between David and Shimshon. And it also shows us that those parallels are mirrored, that those parallels are opposite. I don't know if I would say that Shimshon uses it for bad, but he does not accomplish, in my opinion, what he had the potential to accomplish. So whereas I wouldn't have framed it in that way, it's still a useful midrash for my purposes. If I had another one that was less excessive, I might be more inclined to bring that one. But that's the only midrash that I found that compares David and Shimshon.
Okay, here's a question from our local psychologist. He wants to know if we know anything about Shimshon's parents.
We know a great deal about Shimshon's parents. It's one of the, I think, really foundational parts of the story, is that we have a whole chapter on their parents. And as I've said a few times, that would take a whole nother shiur to explain. But I'll say very briefly about the story, which is the entire chapter 13 in Sefer Shoftim, Perek Yud Gimel, is all about his parents. I'm going to say it as follows, and I apologize because I can't unpack this, right? Shimshon's mother is very wise and not very righteous, and Shimshon's father is very righteous and not very wise. Zeal Ugmar, right? You need to take that one and run with it, but I can't possibly unpack it. If that helps as a psychologist, perhaps it does. But it's not as though David's parents were very instructive in helping him to fulfill his destiny. Hi, Gabby.
Okay, you guys got to see a lot of each other this morning.
Yes.
Okay, here is a comment from Gil Yoshor, Joe's son. Interesting and inspiring that a tribe that was descendant of a concubine achieved such a leading role.
Very, very astute comment. The Midrashim talk about that. They actually use this particular example of Dan being this very important and central tribe, and particularly Dan's role building the Mishkan and the Mikdash, which was the second point that we made earlier. They use it as a proof that one should not regard the tribes who come from the concubines as of lesser status. So that's an astute comment, because that's exactly what the Midrashim want to say. You're on mute.
I do not see any more. I do not see any more questions in my chat. Do you have any that came to you directly, Yael?
So let's see. No, I think that they all came to everyone.
Okay. Well, then that wraps up the
Rabbi,
question. I don't see anyone with their hand up.
Rabbi, Dr. Goldman at this end.
Okay.
I sent it to you on your on the phone.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm only monitoring the Zoom.
No, that's fine. You
Thank you.
have to take a grain of salt about David. David is portrayed as a shepherd and an honest guy as a child, but he becomes a military full-powered leader in the time of Saul. He knew how to fight with a sword, which you were denying him to do. He knew how to lead a military campaign. So he changes. He's not the same David, quite the same David as the child. He now, and you could even go further, and that's why I got into trouble with Bathsheba too.
Yeah. The David story is such a complex, and as I said, such a long story. We have so much information on the David story that I'm just going to sort of, back out of properly answering that one. But I think that the important point that I wanted to make here is that certainly David's initial sketch, the initial portrait of David, is one in which he really is presented very, very in a very similar way to Shimshon, and he has this kind of both fearlessness and confidence that could lead him on a path that he has to decide how to, where he's going to take that path. Does he eventually go awry? Well, I certainly accept that he does. I think in the end, he kind of finds his footing again, unlike Shimshon. But this kind of charisma and passion, it can very easily lead people astray. And that does seem to happen to some degree with David, or not to some degree, it does seem to happen with David. And yet at the same time, I can't leave it like that, because the Tanakh shows us how David rehabilitates himself in this really, I think it's an extraordinary story of rehabilitation. I mean, I think it's one that we learn, perhaps the Abarbanel says, we learn more from his rehabilitation than we learn from his sin, right? So, that's the main part of the story. But okay, that's going to have to be for a different occasion.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ziegler. We are going to give the last word to Shula. If you could unmute yourself, and then we'll say Yom Tov and Shavua Tov to everyone.
I'd like to thank you all for coming and remembering Joe. When I saw the list that Yael presented to choose from. So I was attracted immediately to David and Shimshon because they were people of strength. And Joe, he was my hero. I, especially when he was fighting for his life. I do hope that and believe that he's resting in peace, and I also believe that he's and pray that he should be a militz Yoshor for all of us. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Shula. And thank you everyone for joining. And again, thank the Yoshors and Kupfermans for sponsoring this wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much, Dr. Ziegler, for joining us. And we'll say goodbye now. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Shavua tov.
Thank you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה, היה מקסים.
תודה.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye,
It was
Ma.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Lots of love to you, Ma.
Wonderful to see you.
Hey, Yishai. Hi.
They don't see you because they have my
Oh.
back to them. Bye, Ma. Love you. Bye, Deborah.
Bye, Adam. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Carol.
Hi,
Bye, Matt.
Shula.
Bye, Elaine.
Hi, Shula.
If the family wants to stay on and chat, I'm going to stop the recording and
No.